Item 5 is discussion, possible action, consideration to approve the refunding of outstanding district bonds. The board will receive a presentation on refunding outstanding bonds. District can provide direction to staff. And
okay, I'll take just a minute. This is, as you're aware, we've got several $1 million in bonding outstanding, and the interest rate on those bonds is fairly high. With the current interest rate market, over the last couple of years, we've been looking at the possibility of doing, in essence, a refinancing of those bonds as it becomes available. You can't just willy-nilly refinance. You have to do it on a call date, and there's based on the covenants of each individual bond. But we do have a couple of them coming up where there is a possibility to do that. And so we've been talking with our bond consultant and bond counsel to consider those options. And tonight I've asked Marty Johnson from J&A to come up and do a presentation regarding our proposed refinance. You have that in your packet, and we'll just turn the time over to Marty and let him walk us through the process.
Do I need to be over there to change pages, or
tell us when to switch?
Just Aaron will take care of it for me, or somebody? So you can go to the next page. As Wes mentioned, the district has a number of bonds outstanding, $29 million worth. And this is a process that we've gone through before. Some of you may remember in 2011 we refinanced bonds. One of the things that I wanted to remind you about is in the previous years when the district was first formed and started, we could only issue revenue bonds. Those were bonds that were secured by the revenues that you received from the users of the water, connection fees, et cetera, and we had to have coverage of 125 times debt service. So for every dollar of debt service, we had to have pledged revenues of $1.25 essentially. And in 2007, I believe, we got the legislation changed that created the district to allow us to attach a general obligation pledge to those bonds. That lowered the coverage requirement. It also got rid of the need for a reserve fund, which, you know, back when you were formed, we could invest a reserve fund at 4 or 5%, it would carry itself. Today you're earning 1/4% on that money, and so it really doesn't make a lot of financial sense to have that. And so that's the difference between the revenue bonds and the bonds that also have the general obligation pledge. So if we can go to the next page. So this just shows you the various bonds, and as Wes mentioned, there are 2 bonds coming up, the 2004 and the 2006, that we could look at refinancing. The average interest rate on the outstanding 2004 bonds is a 3.82, and the 2006 is a 4.12. Those actually historically are very, very attractive rates. The difference is that today we could get those bonds at a much lower rate. In fact, we might be able to do the 2004 refinancing, giving the short term of that, at a rate somewhere around 2%. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. So again, the refinancing is based on having lower interest rates, much like on your home mortgage. If you've got a home mortgage at 5% and interest rates are at 3%, you go and you refinance it. Typically, though, the difference here is with most, home mortgages, you refinance and you're, say 5 years into a 30-year mortgage. When you're done with your refinancing, you still have a 30-year mortgage. In this case, we refinance the bonds over the same term. So the 2014 bonds, for example, mature in 2019. After the refunding, we would still have them mature in 2019. So it isn't that we're extending the payments in order to generate the savings. We are truly benefiting from the lower interest rates. And again, as I mentioned, based on current market conditions, the 2004 bonds and 2006 bonds are the ones that we currently have our eye on. So in the refinancing process, we size refunding bonds. And again, much like with a home mortgage, you borrow enough money to pay off your old loan, cover whatever closing costs you have so that you're not out of pocket anything, and then you go ahead and generate your savings from that. We do the same thing here with the refunding bonds. We provide for the payment of the bonds on their call date. So in the example of the 2004 bonds, that's June 1 of this year, or whatever date after that we pick. We take care of all of the transaction costs. And then if there are monies that will be freed up from the reserve fund, which is our intent in this case, we then take that as a credit. So we will downsize the bond issue to use that money so that you're borrowing less overall. Those bond proceeds are placed in an irrevocable escrow account in order to pay off those old bonds. That means that once we've done this, you can't suddenly change your mind and say, hey, we would like to take that $3 or $4 million out of the bank. It's there, it's done, that's all it can be used for. What we're proposing here is refinancing the bond is what we call medium-term obligations. The revenue bonds that you currently have outstanding, as I mentioned, require a reserve fund. The general obligation revenue bond process doesn't require a reserve fund, but it takes about 6 months to go through that authorization process. So if we started now, we wouldn't be done with that until sometime in August. And so we're looking for something that will allow us to take advantage of interest rates in the current market. And so that's where this medium-term obligation idea comes from. And it's used very frequently by local governments in the state of Nevada. Basically, the requirements are that it is payable from all legally available funds of the district. And I'll show you kind of an example of how that works, which is basically your net pledged revenues after we've covered the outstanding bonds and other non-pledged revenues. For example, the sales tax revenue you get. Because you're not a member of SNWA, you cannot pledge those revenues to bonds. However, they would be available to be used for this type of a financing. Other revenues that you've got, your fund balance, etc., are all available to repay these bonds, just like they are your revenue bonds and your general obligation revenue bonds.
Doesn't our sales tax come up here? Is that a ways down the road?
No, we're still, it would be available and is scheduled to be available through the term of this bond.
Go ahead. So this walks you through the refunding, and I recognize there's a lot of information on this page, but you can see on the left side the refunded bonds, the interest at 3.87%, and then what the proposed refunding bonds would look like. And you can see we'd be paying off almost $3.4 million of bonds and issuing just over $3 million of bonds. And we're able to do that because we've got the refunded bonds that we've got to pay off. We've got to pay the interest that's due June 1st, but we're going to be able to take money out of the reserve fund to the tune of about $475,000. Because the refunded bonds are no longer secured by that reserve fund, that debt service no longer counts in that calculation. And then there would be the transaction costs, and all of those added up require us to borrow $3.1 million. And then you can see 3.1 million and I've estimated 2.1% here, generates savings of about $630,000 over the life of the bonds. But we do adjust that for the fact that that reserve fund is already your money. We can't tell you that you're going to save it when it's already something you have. So we back that out, and the net savings are about $150,000 from doing the transaction. Present value, that's about $117,000. Right around that 3% threshold that most governments look at in terms of determining whether or not a refunding makes sense.